read the people. So I've decided that what we're really doing is playing a game that some of you will be old enough to remember called Hollywood Squares, where the TV screen was filled with celebrities and others, and I'll take Paul Lind to block. If that sentence makes any sense to you at all, then you were probably there as well. So thank you for inviting me to talk about the state of the industry. There we go. I'm going to do simple PDF sort of things today. The question that I want to wrap this presentation around to begin with is your wine glass half empty or half full, or is as you view your life in general these days? Because gosh, 2021 was quite a workout, wasn't it? With ups and downs, all sorts of things happening. Usually when I speak to industry groups, my job is to provide an international perspective to what's going on. And so if we, taking an international perspective on what's been happening to the US industry this year, well, it helps provide just a little bit of perspective. That, for example, one of the biggest effects in the US wine industry has been the closures of restaurants and bars and others. The loss of on-trade sales has been very significant. It's one of the, we're looking at the economy generally. The service industry has been very badly impacted, perhaps the worst of any industry by the by COVID, and then by the government reactions to COVID. But the loss of on-trade sales has been very significant, especially for some sectors of the economy. Some wineries, especially very large wineries, have been able to make up the volumes and maybe almost the values by shifting to off-trade sales, but the lost on-trade sales. So if we look at this from an international perspective, the problem is still there, but European producers have suffered much worse than we have. So it could have been much worse. Our glass could have been half empty instead of half full. Back in March, the OIV estimated that for European wineries as a group, as a broad group, the lost sales could amount to about 50% of their total production. Just devastating. No wonder that actually billions of liters of European wine have been pushed into crisis distillation, something that hasn't happened in the US market. Interestingly, this difference between the US, where we took a heavy hit, but then other countries where the hit was much heavier, which then puts pressure on them to shift sales to the US. This was even worse in spirits. Spirits have done pretty well in the US market. And one reason why is that when the bars closed down and you couldn't go get a Manhattan at your local bar, or it wasn't either legal or maybe safe to do so, people went to Costco and they bought large containers and made the drinks at home. They made so many drinks at home like this that, for example, suddenly vermouth became a thing. As people stocked their bars to do this at home. Well, apparently in Europe, going and buying large bottles of spirits in order to do this is something that doesn't really happen and hasn't really happened. So whereas the spirits industry in the US has done pretty well, in Europe, the spirits industry has had a more significant decline. So our glass may be half full, but theirs is half empty. Another interesting international perspective is if we look at the trade wars, because the US has been caught coming and going in trade wars. And for those of us in the wine industry, this is kind of an uncomfortable thing, because I think that open trade is actually pretty good for wine, and especially the American wine industry. And the more open it is, I think, given our products we have available, the more open it is, the better it is. But we have put tariffs, retaliatory tariffs on European wines especially. And I understand that with the new Biden administration, there's not going to be any immediate relief for this. And so this has had created some major issues for US importers and distributors. And then we've been subject to tariffs, especially from China. China imposed very high tariffs on US wines, again, in retaliation. And given that China was seen by many wineries, and some wineries in Idaho, I know, as an important market, this has been very bad. But it could be much worse. The trade wars are not good for us, but they've been worse for others. Feel lucky that you aren't in Australia, because Australia is called the lucky country or the lucky continent because it went for a whole generation almost without an important recession. But now they've crossed political wires with China. And so now Australian wine is subject to a 200+% tariff. It's been so bad that you may have read that Treasury Wine Estates has shaken its foundation, and it's having to change the way it does everything. And if you look at this little chart, I promise not to have too many charts in this presentation, but if you look at this chart, which is supplied by Wine Australia, you can see the problem. Australia traditionally sold its biggest markets were the UK market, where sales were big in volume, but margins were very low and pressure on costs were increasing. And the US market, which has been through a cycle and is currently in a down cycle. So they invested enormous sums and efforts to build the Chinese wine market. And they were enormously successful. The volumes were high, but the margins were higher than any place else where they sold wine. You can see $1.3 billion, and last year, in 2019, I guess, increasing in China. The Chinese market was bigger than the next 3 or maybe 4 markets combined. Australia had become a Chinese wine producing country. And now suddenly that's all disappeared with no indication that the Chinese will change their policies, with very little prospects. If you read about the new Penfolds wines, the Penfolds California wines, it's their attempt to get around and get their foot back in the Chinese market by switching and becoming an American wine company. We'll see how that works out for this. Oops, sorry. Let me back up. Here we go. When the pandemic recession began, some of us wine economists were asked, what's going to happen to the dollar? And what we thought would happen is that whenever there's a crisis in the world, the dollar rises. That's just the dollar goes up as people rush to safety. And that this seemed like this was going to be a problem for the US wine industry, because a rising dollar means that the imports of foreign wine, especially foreign bulk wine, would be cheaper, and it would be more difficult to export wine as well. And so we were concerned that the rising dollar would be detrimental to the US industry. And the dollar did rise against some currencies. If you look, the first of the 2 charts is the US dollar compared to the Argentine peso. And sure enough, the dollar has zoomed against the peso, or rather, the peso has sunk like a rock. And our Argentine wine is, in fact, a pretty good buy on the US market. Old prices have risen, but the peso continues to fall even further. Now, what was interesting is the thing that surprised many of us, is that the US dollar has actually sunk itself compared to the euro. This is the dollar and the euro down till the end of 2020, at which point the Economist magazine said that the dollar had 10% more to fall before of this. And so what this has done, of course, is the falling dollar has made European wine imports more expensive. And so again, this is kind of an interesting half full or half empty. Imagine if you're a European producer. Imagine if you bet the rent on making rosé wines in Provence, for example. You dodged the bullet maybe on the first US tariff because your alcohol levels could be adjusted enough, but the second one hit you strong. And then the falling dollar has made the euro more expensive and your wines even more expensive. And the funding available for crisis distillation isn't going to go on forever. Gosh, the world of wine is in quite a pickle. The U.S., we face enormous challenges, but you know what? The challenges that others face these days are so much worse. Now we have a chance to talk about this at the Unified Symposium, and I know that some of you attend the Unified Symposium every year, and hopefully some of you logged on this year for our virtual event. I've been lucky for over 10 years now. I've been on the State of the Industry panel, and so I not only get to attend the meetings, but I also get to engage in the behind-the-scenes talk as the people who are involved in trying to figure out what's going on in the U.S. economy, as they begin to try to think through things together for all of this. And so some of the interesting things that came out of the Unified Symposium this year was, first of all, the idea of market balance. The U.S., as most other wine producing countries, has had a structural surplus of wine now for many years. In terms of the ups and downs, the cycles in the wine industry, we've had a lot of wine. We've in California, especially, but Washington State as well, a lot of wine has been there. And this year, 2020 going into 2021, seemed like we were as close to balance as we've been for a long time. Overall, different situations for specific grape varieties, of course, but the question that we discussed was, does this mean that we can take a deep breath and relax? And the answer was no, because the structural balance, the temporary balance we had this year seemed to be much more a matter of weather conditions this year, and especially the specific wildfire situations in many places. So the market balance that we're seeing, which shows up into bulk wine availability being much closer to equilibrium than you would expect. This seems like it's a temporary thing, which brings us to what I call Mandelas Rule, named for Nelson Mandela. On my first trip to South Africa, someone told me that Nelson Mandela once said that they say that time fixes everything, but you know, sometimes you have to fix things yourself. And I like that. You know, time cures all, but sometimes you have to cure it yourself. And so I've called that Mandela's Rule. If you look it up on the interweb, they tell you that Andy Warhol said it first, but I don't care. I like the idea that Nelson Mandela, thinking about South Africa, said you have to fix things yourself. And so this applies, I think, to the structural surplus. We might wait, as we have in the past, for the structural surplus to disappear, because in the past, it was part of the cycle. We'd have too many grapes online, too much wine coming on, but the demand for wine would grow up and fill it up. It's like hand-me-down clothes when you were a kid. You get your older brother's too big shirt, but you grow into it, right? And so we used to would think, oh, we can just grow into having rising demand grow into our surplus. But you know what? That's not really going to happen. We have to fix it ourselves. And so Jeff Bitter, who's on my Unified panel, the head of Allied Grape Growers, said, you know what? You have to pull out grapes. You have to adjust to what's going on in this. And I was interested to read last week that the head of St. Michel Wine Estates, David Deary, who used to be the head of Treasury Wine Estates, was talking about sort of applying Mandela's Rule to the Chateau. When he said that they had, as he put it, they had exited some of their surplus stocks of wine. So they got rid of the overhang of wine so they could reset and start again. Interestingly, this is what he did in Australia for Treasury in a relatively brief time that he was the CEO there as well. So when there are problems, you can wait for time to fix them, but nah, you got to fix them yourself. One reason why you can't wait for time to fix the structural surplus of wine is that it's a war out there. And this is something that Danny Brager and John Morkel on the Unified panel both talked about. It was the idea that if we're looking at the wine market in the last few years, especially 2020 going into 2021, but not just that, what we find is that the growth of beverage alcohol consumption, well, the growth really isn't there. It's pretty much a static, big category, beverage alcohol consumption. And so if we think about the problem of wine as wine versus wine, like the old Mad Magazine, Spy versus Spy, wine versus wine. That if you want to sell more wine, you've got to take it away from other wine. Well, it is zero sum in that regard. But you know what? The real challenge is to take market share away from other beverage alcohol categories. That it's a fight for market share, and it's wine versus beer versus spirits. And you know who's the winner in this war so far? It's hard seltzer. It's just kicking everybody's butts. The growth in the hard seltzer and exceeds the growth of far exceeds the growth of the category for this. So it's a war out there, and it's a matter of thinking strategically, not just about wine, but about how products can fit in to broader categories as well. One thing that Jeff Bitter talked about that surprised a lot of us was what I call here the varietal musical chairs situation. That the grape varieties that are most in demand are changing somewhat and in interesting ways. For the last few years in California and in Washington State as well, seems to me that we've had a boom in Cabernet Sauvignon, and you've seen this. That Cabernet Sauvignon was a fast-growing, large category for wine producers. Cabernet was the most planted wine grape in California and Washington State for many years. In Napa Valley in the North Coast, it had the highest, very high prices. And so it became the sure thing. It became the product that if you didn't know what to plant, well, you planted Cabernet Sauvignon, because how could you go wrong? The demand kept rising, the prices kept rising, and that no one was going to criticize you for planting Cabernet Sauvignon. But if you planted some other grape variety, well, you could be guessed wrong, and that would be very bad. Well, now the Cabernet Sauvignon bubble that I've been fearing seems to have burst, and the bulk wine prices are going down. The sales have plateaued, and Jeff Bitter told us that the grapes were coming out of the ground. That even as recent plantings of Cabernet Sauvignon in California are coming online, there are grapes being pulled out and are replanted or grafted in some cases with other grape varieties, and that probably is good news, because if there are two ways that bubbles can resolve, and one is to burst, and the other is to have sort of the air let out of them a little at a time. And I see this as the letting the air out of the Cabernet Sauvignon bubble, but it's still a problem. What he told us that surprised us the most, however, was that he saw the same thing happening to Pinot Noir. He thought that Pinot Noir plantings had gone past their peak and that there was a movement away from this taking place. He also said that he was seeing Sauvignon Blanc becoming a more desirable wine planting, which is another way of saying that the bloom, the flower of Chardonnay markets as maybe fading somewhat as well. We used to think of Sauvignon Blanc as being that very popular New Zealand wine, the Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, which has had extremely high growth rates year after year after year after year. And what Jeff told us and Danny Brager backed up was that the interest in Sauvignon Blanc and other white wines of that nature was now being extended beyond certain import categories much more broadly. So creating more opportunities. It's an interesting situation, I think. I want to talk about this sort of cryptically labeled item here, Tolstoy's Happy Families, because I want to present you with a little bit of a puzzle that I'll be honest, I created this puzzle not because I knew the answer, but because I wanted to try to think about what the answer might be. And I think I've got one now. Do you remember what Tolstoy said about happy and unhappy families? Tolstoy said that all happy families are the same, but that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own unique way. And I've always thought about this for some reason. And I've wanted to try to apply it to successful and unsuccessful wine companies or wine segments, if you will, for this. My idea was, well, maybe all happy or successful wine companies have something in common that makes them successful, makes them happy, and that the unhappy ones, the ones that are a little less successful, maybe they are all have unique and special problems. So I decided to test this on something that happens right at the end of my State of the Industry session at the Unified Symposium. Right at the very end, there is recognition for success. It's usually rushed because we're almost always out of time. And it shows up and disappears in a hurry, but it's kind of interesting. At the start of my years at the Unified, John Fredrickson of the Gomberg-Fredrickson Report would declare a winery of the year. And it was usually one of the big, broad, most successful wineries. Obviously, it's the winery of the year. Often it would be a battle between Constellation Brands and the Gallo Company for this. John retired a couple of years ago, and his replacement on the State of the Industry panel is Danny Brager, recently of Nielsen, but now Brager's Beverage Alcohol Consulting Company. And what Danny has started to do is also recognize success, but instead of recognizing just one company, he gives, like the Olympics, he gives bronze, silver, and gold medals for the most successful companies in each category. So I want to draw your attention to this, show you this year's medal winners, the medal winners for 2020, and ask you to be thinking about what is it that successful wine companies of different sizes have in common. So are you ready for this? This is me being in my old role as professor, saying I'm going to give you some data. Let's try to figure out what we think these companies have in common. So start off with his gold medal wineries. Now, the criteria for gold, silver, and bronze changes a little bit every year. It's based on Nielsen data, so you know that it's mostly, it's going to be the off-trade wine sales. And the way he's got it, the way Danny put it together for this year is that we're looking at the large wineries. So we're looking at wineries with very large total production, and we want to look at wineries, let me get this settled here again, and we're looking at wineries that have both, one, very large absolute wine sales gains in 2020, and then also large percentage gains. So if they're big, they sold a lot more wine, but if Gallo sells another 100,000 cases of wine, well, that's a drop in its bucket. And so it's adjusted for scale. And so here are the three. It's kind of interesting to look at them. Are these the three wineries that you would think of as being enormously successful? Yeah, well, of course, they're important, but they're so very different. If you just take a look at them, for example, start off the Deutsch family winery. You know, they're the company that made Le Boeuf Beaujolais Nouveau. They built Beaujolais Nouveau into a phenomenon. And then they moved over and they built Yellowtail into a phenomenon. And now it's, among other things, they have a lot of wines that they work with, but Josh Family Winery. Think about Delicato. Delicato, old California family firm, lots of different wines. But this year, wow, powered by bag-in-box wines. They gave it a big push as consumers shifted to working from home and schooling from home and doing everything from home. More and more consumers had those premium 3-liter boxes in the fridge, and Delicato rode that wave. And then Riboli Family Winery, San Antonio Winery. It's a Los Angeles-based, very old firm. You'll notice here that Danny put repeat 5 times. For 5 years in a row, Riboli Family Winery had made his gold medal list. And you know what their signature product is? It's Stella Rosa wine. So imported wine from Italy, sweet wine, wouldn't you say? Low alcohol wine. In fact, the alcohol levels are so low. How low are they, Professor? Well, they're so low that they have to have the nutritional label on the back because they don't meet the legal requirement for alcohol level to be considered wine. They're considered food, and they have to list the ingredients and the calories and the carbohydrates and so forth. If you haven't had a glass of Stella Rosa for a while, well, you might want to check it out, or at least look at that back label on the category. So here seems to me that these are 3 very, very different wineries, aren't they? Bag-in-box, sort of premium supermarket wines, and then wines that appeal to a different segment. So to start with those 3, very different wineries. What do they have in common? Of course, they have one thing they have in common is that they're all very much available for supermarkets and shops and so forth. I want to jump now to the bronze medal wineries to have you take a look at these. And so these are the smallest of them. They're still very large because they show up on the Nielsen data. So you've got Gerard Bertrand, for example, and that's all about rosé. You have Union Wine Company, and they're sort of riding the wine in a can category very much. 1821, heard of that? Well, so that's the company that imports and distributes the Zonine Italian wines. That's a Prosecco play. But then you've got Dow, Han family, Michael David, a lot of really interesting, but very, 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 very different wineries. And then finally, to look in the middle now, the silver medal wineries. So take a look at this. This is a look at those. I mean, you've got some wineries like Buzzball, and for example. Well, what is Buzzball wine? Well, this is a fluke in the Nielsen data. Buzzball and some of these others that you see here, what they make are single serve cocktail sort of things based on wine. In some cases, though, the wine is imported from Mexico, where it is made from agave fruit, interestingly enough. So some of these things are things that you and I might scratch our head and say, is this really wine? It's not wine necessarily as we think of it here. Others like O'Neill, one of their important part is that private label wines. Very successful. Private label wines have been one of the growth factors for this. Oliver Wine, have you heard of this? Oliver Wine is the largest winery in Indiana. And it makes a lot of wine out of hybrid grapes. And its biggest selling product, and it is now ramping up to 700,000 cases a year. So we're actually talking about a pretty big product run, is what they call soft wine. Soft red, soft white. Sound familiar at all? And then of course, you'll notice Precept. Precept for the last 3 or 4 years has consistently been on these gold, silver, bronze medal. I think the last 2 years, it's been a gold medal winner. And Precept is a winery that I'm quite interested in. It's obviously a very important winery in Idaho, because as I've written, Precept seems to have been very good, the people at Precept, of identifying where is the growth? Where is the growth in the wine industry? If the category overall is stagnant, where is the growth? And to rather assertively move into those growth areas to grow in an overall market. And then that made me realize something about what I think these various companies have in common is that each of the companies that has been successful in the past, the companies that were successful were the companies that were sort of broadcast companies that made wine for the whole market, that they were producing wine that everyone would buy, or that a large part would buy. And that in the new market that we're in now, it's all about finding a niche, and finding a niche where the growth is possible, and then filling that niche as successfully as they possibly can. And so in a way, we've moved from the world of where people read Time magazine and US News and Newsweek magazine, where everybody was reading the same thing. Everybody was watching the same 3 national network channels, to one where there's narrowcasting and narrow publishing. And it's all about being successful within your niche. And here I think we see that the most successful wineries, the gold, silver, and bronze medal wineries in the US market, are wineries that are successful in filling particular niche in the market. Well, what's ahead for the future? Well, I was reading in the New York Times today where they say that many economists see the roaring 20s, that we'll have a boom coming. Other economists are more pessimistic about the economy overall and are suspicious of a boom. In the wine industry, we have the same sort of thing. Some people say that as soon as consumers are able to go back to restaurants, they won't be able to resist it. And others think that maybe a long time before consumers are comfortable hanging out in bars and restaurants and so forth. My thinking now is that it is going to be both. That some parts of the economy will boom and some parts of the wine economy will boom as well. But others will find consumers suspicious and opportunities hard to find. And then there's always what I call here the curse of the black swan. The 2020 was about this black swan is an event with very low probability, but very high impact. And that's what COVID was for the world in 2020. In 2021, well, will we have another black swan? Well, we have to not get too stressed, as our previous speaker has said, but we have to be prepared for the fact that the world is changing and we have to adjust to it. And so that's my report on the state of the industry.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. Does anyone have any questions for Mike? Looks like Hadley has a question. She's working on typing in. We have to get comfortable with awkward silences on Zoom calls. We've noticed.
Well, it's okay. In the teaching business, they tell us to wait out the silences. Yeah. Add a little pressure.
Yeah.
Mike, I was curious, are you going to write another book? Like, I love your books. Like, where are you with that?
Well, I never say never, but I think I've retired from writing books. So I've written kind of a scary number of them up to this point. So maybe it's okay to do that, but I appreciate it, Moya. Thank you very much.
And you still have your blog that you're doing, right?
That's right. Yeah. So the weekly blog post, which I find is a good way to communicate with people. So I'm kind of happy to do things there. It's to explain the book part of it, that writing a book and then promoting it has become a social media thing. More than in the past. It's being an author is like being a winemaker. You find yourself in a different business than you used to be. So, well, thanks. Let's see. Brenna, could you, if we have questions, could you read them to me?
Yeah, absolutely. Martin Physician is asking, is there looking to be any relief coming on supply chain issues, example, glass from China?
Oh, that's a good question. And I don't see it happening. I'm sorry to say, there was a lot of hope throughout the wine industry that with the Biden administration, which was much more amenable to opening trade markets and so forth, there was a lot of people were hopeful that the problems that had affected imports of wine and disrupted supply chains and so forth, that this would be cured. But on the one hand, the Biden administration seems to be very much committed to open markets, but also to multilateral discussions. And so I think as soon as they opened shop, they were hit by every interest that wanted to see this tariff or that tariff or these other things reduced. And they said, all right, we can't do this all at once. So we're going to wait and do it as part of a multilateral agreement that will happen eventually, but it won't happen immediately. At the same time, some of the issues on the supply chain, as you know, have to do with the availability of containers and the cost of containers and getting product on ships and so forth. And this seems not to be solved in the short term. It looks to me like container rates have tripled and quadrupled, and you've got to know someone to get. So in other words, I think we can't breathe, take that breath, and relax on that issue as well. That's going to be a problem for at least another year, and hopefully these things will move towards solution in 2022.
Awesome. It looks like Hadley has a question. What are wineries, vineyards doing to make up the bubble fading of Cab Sauv and Pinot?
No, and so right now it's they're selling product at lower prices. What we found is in California, because California is where I have the best data, that some of the marginal North Coast products are being sold at Central Coast prices, and Central Coast products are being sold at California prices, which means, you know, Lodi prices and so forth. And so for now, it's sort of filling in a tier lower than it was designed to produce at. And that's what we have at this point, that there is a market for it at the right price. But some of the business models aren't built around those prices. So there is real pain, and it won't go away until the market finds a little bit better balance. That's not good news. I'm sorry.
And it looks like we have one more question. Colin is asking, what do you think of Idaho as a market segment in the wine industry?
Oh, emerging. Gosh, you guys have such great wines. And the wines with a nice value proposition, I think, as well. But God, it's a tough market to get attention in. So I'm thinking of that it's a lot of it's about focus on this. A few years ago, someone asked me about the China market because people dream about, used to dream at least, about selling market in China. And so I asked an old buddy of mine, Tom Hedges from Hedges Cellars in Red Mountain, about China. And Tom said to me, China, Mike? No, Denver. You know, if I took the same money that I was going to put into getting my wines in China, if I put that same money in Denver, I'd be able to sell a lot more wine and make a lot more money. And so I'm thinking that targeting markets is a good way to go and to get the Idaho word out. So it's not an easy proposition. You've got a lot of composition, but gosh, you've got such great people and such wonderful wine. I think the future is bright.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mike. It was awesome hearing you speak, and I think the industry really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah. All right.